My name is Ed Falvo, and I'm a member of the Discovery Expedition. I'm in the role of George Gibson, one of the Kentucky recruits. Well, this is a medical kit like they had on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Captain Lewis spent a month before the expedition began studying in Philadelphia with Dr. Benjamin Rush. Dr. Rush was the most prominent physician in the country at the time. He was very well known. He was friends with Ben Franklin. He signed the Constitution. And one of his famous medicines was Dr. Rush's bilious pills. Dr. Rush's pills are made with a mixture of mercury and jalap, which is a plant root, and they're held together with breadcrumbs as a binding agent. And they took 60 dozen of these with them on the expedition. Basically, if you were given one of these pills, say if you had dysentery or an infection in your intestines, they'd give you one of these. You'd have to hurry to the bathroom, because in less than 10 minutes you would be cleared out to the extent that just liquid would be coming out of you. Also, to make you go to the bathroom, they had saltpeter, and if they're out of saltpeter, they could give you gunpowder, because saltpeter is one of the ingredients in gunpowder. White vitriol was used to help treat sore eyes. This enabled them to trade with the Indians, because a lot of the Indian tribes that they encountered whilst going over the mountains, many of them had eye problems caused by sand and various things, so they would trade with them. The captains would treat the Indians' sore eyes with white vitriol. The Indians in turn would give them dogs for food. Over the course of the expedition, they ate a total of 190 dogs. They had pulverized assafoetida. This was an Asian spice, and you would put this in a bag that you'd wear around your neck, and it was supposed to ward off sickness and disease. They had chocolate with them on the expedition. Once when Captain Clark wasn't feeling well, he was given a drink of hot chocolate. It was thought that chocolate would make you feel better. Sage was used to help clear the mind. That's why someone with a very quick mind is often referred to as being a wise old sage. So if your mind was addled, they could give you sage. When Sacagawea was giving birth at Fort Mandan, she had a very hard time about it. And a Frenchman living there named Jessamay told the captains of an old Indian remedy where you take rattlesnake rattles and crush them and give them to the person. Well, Captain Lewis crushed 2 segments of rattlesnake rattles and gave it to Sacagawea, and in 10 minutes she delivered baby Pomp. And the medicines that they use today to induce labor contain elements that are found in rattlesnake rattles. Just goes to show you that some of the old Indian medicines actually had some basis behind them, even though they didn't know what it was at the time. Another one of those was Peruvian bark. Peruvian bark was used to treat malaria. Peruvian bark contains quinine, which they use for malaria today. It's thought that Captain Lewis may well have had malaria while they were going down the Ohio River, and he suffered from some fevers and ague. At the mouth of the Marias River, Sacagawea got very sick, and the captain gave her spring water from the sulfur springs that emit forth there. And the minerals in the water helped to balance out her electrolytes, which had been severely depleted by all the bleeding and purging that they'd been doing. So it probably saved her life to give her this, and actually sort of worked like the way Gatorade would work today, balancing your electrolytes. Cloves were used to treat a toothache. If your tooth was hurting you, you'd take cloves and grind them up and put them on your sore tooth. Now, if your toothache didn't go away, and say if it developed into a cavity, they didn't have dental drills back then, so you had to have the tooth out. For that, they had a tool called a tooth key. Basically, you would hook this over your tooth and twist it, and the hook would break through your gum and your jawbone and twist out the tooth from underneath the root. Then, if there are any little bits of the root left over, you'd use a dental elevator to go in and dig them out. And that, of course, was done with no pain medicine, because they wouldn't have wasted their valuable anesthetic on something like a quick twist. And really, by the time that you actually went to have your tooth taken care of, you were in such pain, because you wouldn't go if you just had a slight toothache, if you knew this was in store for you. So you waited until it was so unbearable that you were basically saying, oh gosh, anything to get this horrible toothache over, give me the tooth key. Now, in the time of Lewis and Clark, the main thought of health was that you had 4 humors in the body. The 4 humors are blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if there was an imbalance in the 4 humors, or if you had bad humors in your body, you would have to get them out. So let's say my assistant here, Pete, let's say he's not feeling any well. You don't look very well, do you?
I don't look well.
No, he looks horrible. So we would take our bleeding bowl, put it up to his arm. You would take out a phlegm and make a little incision, and all that sick, diseased blood would flow out of his arm into the bleeding bowl, ridding his body of bad humors. Thank you. Now, the reason you used a bleeding bowl was so you could determine how much blood you were taking. It was proportional to how sick you were. If a person was just a little sick, you'd take a little bit of blood. If they were very sick, you'd take a lot of blood. At the time of Lewis and Clark, they believed that there were 12 quarts of blood in the body, so they wouldn't have thought much of taking 4 or 5 quarts. In fact, when George Washington was sick before he died, they treated him by bleeding him a pint of blood an hour for 11 hours, but he still died. Another way of getting the bad humors out of your body was to use a cupping glass. They would heat this until it was very hot and put it on your body. As the air inside would cool, it would create a vacuum, and it would draw all those bad humors into a blister or a boil. You could then cut it open and they'd just flow right out of you. Another thing they had was epipastric unguent. This was made from dried beetles and would be put on your skin to draw a blister. Another way of ridding your body of bad humors. Now, sometimes it was necessary to get medicine into the body very quickly. For that, you had this tool called a clister syringe. Basically, they would fill this up with medicine, and then in the same light as if you were having your temperature taken, they would insert this, and in goes the medicine. And it sort of had a psychological effect in addition to the medicinal effect. Because if a person was treated with this, and the next day you came up to them and said, "Are you feeling better, or do you need me to use this on you again?" Most likely they said they were feeling better, so it worked. Now, there were many instances of having skin irritations or abrasions. Whenever they were portaging, they were constantly getting their feet stuck full of prickly pear thorns, and they were walking over flint and their feet were getting cut. Once Captain Clark journaled that he pulled out 17 prickly pear thorns by the light of the fire. So for skin irritations or abrasions, they would use basilic ointment. Basilic ointment is made from a mixture of pine resin and beeswax and lard. And the pine resin actually gave it some antibacterial properties. Now, another thing that they got from the Indians was bear grease. They would put bear grease on their bodies to keep mosquitoes from biting them. Mosquitoes were often, as is quoted in the journals, very troublesome, exceedingly troublesome, uncommonly troublesome. In fact, Captain Lewis once wrote, "Our trio of pests still invade us. These are the mosquitoes, eye gnats, and prickly pear thorns, equal to any 3 curses that ever poor Egypt labored under." So that was basically a plague on their existence during the months of June and July of this past year, 1805. Now, I mentioned the clister syringe. Well, sometimes some of the men on the expedition got some unpleasant diseases from the Indian maidens they encountered, often referred to as the French disease. Well, those diseases were treated with mercury ointment, and the mercury ointment was applied into the affected area of the soldiers with this smaller syringe. All of the men of the expedition feared seeing this syringe coming at them. The mercury actually did have an effect on killing the disease. However, the side effects of blindness, insanity, and death are one of the reasons why they switched to penicillin once that was developed. They would treat themselves with mercury until they started salivating and their gums discolored and their teeth loosened. They believed that to be a sign that the disease was being expelled from their body. However, it was really just signs of severe mercury poisoning. Now, Pete, if you can assist me again. Now, many people know the famous bullet wound of the expedition. Captain Lewis was out hunting with Pierre Cruzat. Now, Pierre Cruzat didn't have good vision to begin with. Compounded with this was the fact that Pierre Cruzat only had one eye. Well, he and Captain Lewis were out hunting. Captain Lewis dressed all in buckskin. Pierre Cruzat looked and he saw what looked like deerskin. He thought, wow, that would be good for dinner. He shot, and lo and behold, it was Captain Lewis. And he shot him in his more rear regions, and the bullet went straight through. In and out and in and out. The one bullet made 4 holes. Now, we won't be so ignominious to Pete as to have him shot there. We will just say if he was shot in his arm. Now, you would have your bullet stuck in. You hold that in place, please. Now, first, you would need to find the bullet. So we take our bullet probe. You go into the hole and you poke around in the bullet wound until you hear the tapping on the metal bullet. Next, well, let's say if it's really jammed in there, say if it's jammed in the bone, then you have to get it out the hard way. You take your director, which has a groove running down it, and you stick it in the bullet hole till you reach the bullet. Then you take a knife, this is a little amputation knife, and you slide down that groove until you reach the bullet. Then you can pry it out of the bone or whatever's needed. However, let's say it's not so bad for Pete. He's a nice guy. We want him to have an easy time about it. If it's not jammed in the bone, you could use your bullet extractors. And the bullet extractors have 2 indentations in either side. So you take the bullet extractors, you go into the bullet hole, ferret around a little bit till you find the bullet, then grab onto the bullet and pull it out. So the bullet's out of him, but he still has this bullet wound. So we take our cauterization iron, we heat this up over the fire till it's white hot, and then you seal that bullet wound closed with heat. Then we tell him to come back in a couple days, see if it's infected. Most likely it is infected, so then we have to operate. Now for an amputation, it's kind of painful, so we'd give him some pain medicine for that. We had various pain medicines such as whiskey, rectified spirits, which is wine that's been distilled, or regular wine. However, for an amputation, that's when you really bring out the good stuff. Laudanum. Laudanum is a mixture of whiskey and opium, and just a couple drops of this, he won't even care what we cut off.
Not so sure about that.
Now, we begin by taking our tourniquet. You'd wrap it around his arm, and like so. Okay. And then you twist it down to cut off all the blood flow. Next, you take your capital knife and you cut through all that flesh and muscle all the way down to the bone, making a nice clean cut. You would then take 2 leather straps. You put one above the cut, one below the cut, and 2 guys would pull in opposite directions, pulling all that flesh and muscle out of the way, exposing the bone, giving you some room to work. You then take your capital saw, and you cut through all that bone, and saw right through, making a nice, as smooth as you can cut. After that's done, you take all this and you just throw it away because you don't need it anymore. That's one thing about amputation, it's the quickest way to lose weight. Then you take your tenaculum hook, you go in and you hook his arteries and pull them out, that way you could tie them off to stop the bleeding. Tying 3 overhand knots in an artery is enough to keep it permanently tied. So we would do that. Then you take your smaller cauterization iron and you cauterize all the capillaries to keep them from bleeding. At this point, you can then take off the tourniquet because all of the blood flow has been stopped. Now, if you're a good doctor doing the amputation, you've left a little flap of skin to cover over the stump. You then take out your needles and your linen thread and you sew the flap of skin over, and then he's done. And that's pretty much the Lewis and Clark medical kit.
If I was in camp, by the time we reached Traveler's Rest, all the clothes that I'm wearing were rags. We were dressed in skins. But you know, you guys go to the store today and you buy shoes and you got a left shoe and a right shoe. 200 years ago, there wouldn't be a left shoe and a right shoe. There would be a shoe that would fit either foot called straight-lasted shoes. And they'd be secured by a buckle, and above which we'd have what we call spatter dashers or gaiters. They were made out of canvas and painted with some black tar pitch to help keep the rain out of our shoes. You wouldn't want to march around in wet feet, would you? No. And I've got canvas trousers on. They're called fall front trousers because the front falls down and the men can go to the bathroom real quick and be right back at work. It looks like I've got a diaper on back here, girls, does it? Well, I don't, and you know why? Because 200 years ago, there wasn't such a thing as underwear. Our shirts would be real long and they'd come down to here, and we would just pull that up underneath and tuck it in that extra material in the back there. But you guys are all wearing jeans, or you got some kind of nylon, rayon, polyester material that stretches real well. Well, all these natural fibers of cotton, linen, and wool wouldn't stretch as easily. So if we wanted to bend down, we needed a little extra room in the back, or else we'd split out the back of our pants and we'd have instant air conditioning. That wouldn't be a good thing, would it? And the cap I got on is a fatigue cap. If we were marching in the woods and we came across some berries or some nuts, we'd pick those, put them in the bottom of our cap, tuck that under our belt, and at night when we got back to camp, we'd have a nice little treat. If it was cold out, the same cap would be a nightcap. Keep our head warm at night. So everything that the Lewis and Clark expedition brought with them always had 2 or 3 different purposes or functions. Private Thompson here as a recruit. Private Thompson was in the artillery, which meant he shot big cannons. Unlike me, who carried a musket, I was in the infantry. Private Thompson was in the artillery. And he's dressed a new Captain Clark back there. And Captain Clark has on kind of a funny hat, doesn't she?
What's your first name?
That's called a chapeau de bras, which means a hat carried under the arm, like any gentleman should. Well, it's pointed, it's a little bit different. If all of us infantrymen were in a line on a smoky battlefield and we knew to look for our officer, our captain, we could tell with that point coming down where he was if we looked out down the line, so we could take orders. If the captain was a general, the captain would be mounted, or the general would be mounted on a horse up high on a hill overlooking the battlefield, and the general would wear that same type of hat, but like Napoleon, down over the ears, because up on a smoky battlefield, you'd want to see that silhouette of that big cap. And if the general rode back down the hill the opposite way, we knew the battle wouldn't be going too well. This private right here is getting dressed as I would be dressed as an infantryman. She, instead of the gold buttons for the artillery and the red at the bottom of her regiment coat, she's got white at the bottom of her regiment coat and pewter buttons instead of gold buttons.
Cheap?
Much cheaper. The whole uniform of an infantryman would cost about $2.43. And she's putting on, down by her left hand there, she's got her tomahawk, her bayonet. Behind that, she's got her possibles bag, sometimes called a haversack. The possibles bag would keep your mess kit. You'd have a cup and a fork and a plate, and anything else that a soldier might need of a personal nature. On the right-hand side here would be a cartridge box, which she would need to shoot and load her weapon. And behind that would be her canteen, because it's going to get pretty thirsty out there on the battlefield. And in the back, she's got her pack, which would contain a single blanket and a change of clothes. So she looks, and your name, Private, is?
Alyssa.
Private Alyssa is ready for battle. She's got on her dress round hat, which has a 4-inch strip of bear fur on it. And unlike the captain's hat that has a plume of ostrich feathers, those ostrich feathers couldn't be found except to be imported on the East Coast. So she's got the tail of a white buck to signify her service with the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery. And she's prepared for battle right now. But it would also get cold on the expedition. And we would need somebody up here to kind of model a wool coat. And this is what we would call a capote. This would help keep us warm when it got really cold out. Is that kind of itchy?
Kind of.
Yeah, that's that wool talking. That's that natural fiber.
Welcome aboard the child-sized keelboat. My name is Erin. I'm one of the rangers with the Park Service. This is the Park Service's only traveling exhibit, and we're here traveling through Lolo, Montana. And then, of course, animals that were new to science in the East, but of course have lived here for thousands of years. And we looked at that earlier, it's the antelope horn. They also collected a lot of soil samples. The president wanted to know how fertile the land was in the West, so they got this soil sample. I won't pass that around, it opens up sometimes. But a lot of the weight of their boat consisted of food and supplies that they brought with them, and that was all stored underfoot here. So they had about 10 tons of food and supplies on their journey. It was a lot of weight, and they had to pull it and row it up the river against the current, against the wind, so they couldn't use the sail very often. And doing that burned a lot of calories. If you can imagine rowing for hours of a day, they burned about 6,000 calories each. So if you can imagine, that's like 2 football players in a regular full day's worth of practice. That's how many calories they would burn. But in order to get the energy to row this boat, each man had to eat about 9 pounds of meat a day. So imagine yourselves eating 30 hamburgers today. Think you can handle that? Not me. Not me. But other things they brought along were gifts for Native Americans, and this was a very popular gift. Blue beads, especially valuable to most tribes. So I'll pass those around. Lewis and Clark brought over 150 pounds of beads just to give away. And this very odd gift is a contradiction. You guys are welcome to join us. It's a contradiction in one handle because it's a symbol of peace, being a peace pipe. If I smoke this, you smoke this, we're friends for life. It's also a war tomahawk on the same handle, so it's kind of confusing. And this is one of the most popular gifts. Most of you probably heard about this peace medal. This is the same design on our new nickels. There's 4 designs related to Lewis and Clark, and this peace medal symbol is on the back of one of those nickels. So pass that around. The original peace medals were much lighter than that because there wasn't a mint that can do a coin on both sides. So they'd do a mold of one side, they'd do a mold of the other side, and then sandwich it with a piece of cork. So it was much lighter than a full solid piece of metal. And let's see, we've got a replica or a photocopy of Lewis's journal, one of them at least. And I would love for you all to see it. If you guys are distant, come by today or tomorrow and see it. This is Lewis's handwriting, and it's really amazing how tiny his handwriting was, done with quill pen. So this quill pen was able to make writing that small. So what I want to do right now is invite all of you up to the front to take a look at all these things. You're welcome to handle all of them. You can go inside the captain's quarters and take a look at all the things on the keelboat. Thank you all so much for coming.
I'm here with Alex, and he's going to show us some of the things that he's got here.
So I'll start with this here. This is a replica of a lead canister that Meriwether Lewis invented for the Lewis and Clark expedition. And what this is it's 8 pounds of lead that's hollowed out in the center and filled with 4 pounds of black powder. And you can see here, just on top, there's a piece of cork, and that's where you would pour the powder in. Then you would cork it and just put wax over top, so it would be a watertight seal. And they carried about 70 of these on the expedition, and it's just 12 pounds of dead weight, and this was sort of their solution for ultralight travel. Their primary method of carrying lead and powder would have been in traditional powder kegs as well as lead bars. The reason they would have carried so much lead and powder was because their existence was pretty much dependent upon this. And what this is a replica of an 1803 Harper's Ferry flintlock muzzle-loading black powder rifle. And if not exactly what they carried, it's very much the same thing. And this weapon is like any other black powder rifle, and there's a fairly complicated process in firing it. And the men, as a minimum requirement to join the expedition, would have had to been able to fire this weapon and to hit a target at a certain distance 3 times in a minute. And that was just a minimum requirement. So they were incredibly proficient with their guns, which was good because they relied entirely on them for clothing, food, defense, pretty much every day, all the time. The 2 captains, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, would have also carried some personal weapons as well as these pistols here. And these pistols would have normally been carried on a holster attached to the horn of a saddle on a horse. And this allowed the captains and any officer really a second shot. If you fired your muzzle loading rifle and there was still something coming at you like a bear, this would allow you to get a quick shot off without having to worry about reloading this weapon. Only the officers had this. All the other men would have only had a rifle. To fire the rifle, you would have needed all the things that go with it. And those are pretty much entirely contained in this bag, which would have been worn over the shoulder. And on this you have a powder horn, which would contain the black powder to put in the rifle. And then inside here, this would normally be inside here, you would have a bag that had your lead balls to fire, as well as patch, which is just a small piece of cloth to wrap those balls in. And the military requirement of 1805 said that you should always have 100 rounds, so 100 lead balls ready to go in this pouch at all times. Also in this pouch they would have carried extra pieces of flint for their rifle. They'd go through this flint fairly quickly. As it struck the steel, it would wear it down. And lots of the men had preferences as to a certain type of flint, and they would have carried whatever they liked best. And they would have also carried a small wooden thing like this, and it's called a ball starter. And what you would do is, for example, though you would normally use it in the rifle, you could just start the musket ball down before pulling out a ramrod to get it all the way in. And it was just really a convenience issue. Now, in order to make those 100 lead balls, you would have to have the equipment to do that. And that's especially important here at Travelers Rest, because during the archaeological excavation, what they found was a puddle of spilled lead, presumably spilled making lead balls. So what you would do is you would take a chunk of lead, maybe like this, and you would put it in a cast iron pot, and you'd put it in the fire until it became molten at 650 degrees. And then you would spoon that out, and can I hand this to you? Thanks. And you would pour it into a ball mold like this. And presumably in that process, someone missed and they spilled, and as a result, we were able to find that during the excavation. And then you would just pop this mold open a few seconds later, and out would come a musket ball. Mm-hmm. And so 100 of those at all times. Whenever you had a few days to stop and camp like they did here, you would make as many as you could to create a backlog. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a military expedition, and as such, they were disciplined as military men. And at the beginning of the expedition, there were some disciplinary problems. A man got into a whiskey barrel and got drunk, and he was then brought to court-martial in front of a jury of his peers. Unfortunately for him, they were peers whose whiskey he had just stolen. And so they would be sentenced, and they would be sentenced to be lashed, and they would be lashed with one of these. And this is called a cat of 9 tails, aptly named because it has 9 tails. And some men were sentenced to 25, 50, or 100 lashings. And the man who received 100 lashings was actually given 25 lashings a day over the period of 4 days, which didn't really do him any favors because this will really tear you up. And in fact, when you went and you picked up a cat of 9 tails from the Army Supply Depot or wherever, It would come in a bag like this, except that the bag would be red, red like your shirt, just red from the store. And the reason for that is the cat of nine tails, after just a few lashes, would draw blood. And if you didn't have a red bag, eventually this white bag would be dyed that color anyway. So if you had gotten in trouble and you were brought before a court-martial, the last thing you would ever want to see would be somebody letting the cat out of the bag, because it meant that you were going to get lashed. One of the last things up here is just, it's some of the personal belongings that the men would have carried just to exist out in the woods and out on a day-to-day basis. And they would have had a lot of these supplies, whether they were in what's now Montana or whether they were in a fort back east or maybe in the Ohio territories. And it's pretty straightforward stuff. They would have a mess kit, not unlike we might carry today camping. They might have a plate like this, just a big wooden board really, and you've got the main dish for whatever you're eating, and then you have this side hole for salt. These men ate salted meat all the time, so they enjoyed salt even with fresh meat. And they would have had to carry personal items, they would have had to carry soap, and they would have had to carry a razor, because they were required to shave 3 times a week for the duration of the expedition. They were never the big bushy mountain men that we sometimes picture them as. At all times they were required to keep a clean appearance, and part of that was shaving and part of it was keeping their hair cut pretty short. Not cropped down like military today, but short and neat. And we know that the men carried playing cards. We can pretty easily imagine this expedition sitting around the campfire playing cards at night for as long as their cards lasted, until they got wet and rotted away. We don't know what games they played, but we do know that they carried cards with them. And really, that's about it up here.
I'm Susie, and I'm here with Sue, and she's going to show us a few of the things that she does.
Okay, what we have here is my husband, Michael Ryder, brain tans the leather. Brain tanning is one of the oldest methods known to mankind for tanning and making leather. And what he's tanned everything except the buffalo robes here. He's tanned our clothing, the moccasin leather, this robe here, his coat. He's tanned all that leather. And then what I do is take that and people contract with me to build leather clothes or moccasins or bags, knife sheaths, you name it, we'll build it, and decorate it. And what I mostly do, Michael beads, but what I do is the porcupine quill embroidery, which porcupine quill embroidery is a very ancient American art form, which almost became a lost art in this country due to the dispersion of the tribes and the advent of European beads came into this country and kind of displaced quill work, and that everybody could quill. Everybody could bead. Anybody could bead. To be a quill worker generally meant you were within a guild system, a quill working society where you had to be brought into the society by the elders and taught, and only certain people were allowed to do that. So quill work was a much more, it was less quantity, more quality, less quantity, and beadwork with the advent of European beads became much more prominent. The quill work itself is a lot more time-consuming and intricate work in that you have to acquire the quills, clean the quills, sort the quills, dye the quills, and then the last step in that is getting the quills actually onto the leather. So it's a lot more time-consuming and intricate work as opposed to beadwork, which doesn't take away from beadwork. Beadwork is beautiful too, but quill work's a little bit more intricate.
So did you do all of this yourself?
Yes. I do the acquiring of the hides through the cleaning process, through the dyeing, the quilling, and Michael, like I said, does the tanning. So our product, when we hand a product over to someone, whether it's decorated clothes or bags or whatever, we do it from beginning to end. Wow. We do it, and that's our livelihood. We do this for a living. We do it every day. We tan the leather for this, and then Michael, my husband Michael, did the beadwork for it. Yeah, isn't it beautiful? He did a wonderful job.
It is. It really is pretty.
Yeah, this is his.
Ready when you are.
Golden town coat.
I'm Paul with Michael Dirty Shirts, and we're discussing brain tanning and the preserving of leather. Well, where do we start? Where do we start with this?
You start with the hide, and you take the hide and flesh it. This hide's already been fleshed, which removes all the meat, the fat, the tissue from the backside of the hide. Then you turn the hide over and put it on a beam, and using the same tool you flesh with, you remove the hair and the epidermis. The epidermis is the outside of the skin. It's your top layer. You remove that. Once that process is done, I'm almost finished with this hide here of graining the hide. Then I put it in a frame and dry it into rawhide. After it's dried into rawhide, you have two products. You have a product that can be tanned into leather, or you have rawhide, which was the early primitive duct tape. It fixed everything. They made ropes, they made repairs out of it. The early pioneers, they even made windows out of it. After I've turned it into rawhide, when I'm ready to brain the hide, which is the brains of the animal, and they're used as a tanning solution. They're the chemical that tans the hide into leather. I use a blender. I'm a modern man. I use a blender to blend the brains up into a slurry, and then I cook them. The cooking process kills any bacteria that might be present, because you do have your hands in it and you do work it, and any cuts or anything you'd get an infection from. The rawhide is submerged into the brains, and after you submerge it, you need to work it and turn it into something soft and soaked up the brains. This hide here has been brained. It is ready to dry into leather. By working it this way, you open the fibers up and it absorbs the solution better. After it's been in the brains long enough, which can be vary from 2 hours to 2 days, depending on how hard you work it and how often you work it in the brains. Then you take it out, wring all the excess moisture out of it, and hang it up to dry. As it dries, you stretch the hide. It'll start to stiffen like it's drying, like any material drying, get a little bit stiff, and you stretch it. And you stretch it until it relaxes again. You continue to do this until the hide completely dries. When it's completely dry, you have leather. The next step and the final step is to smoke the hides. You take a hide and fold it in half, sew around the outside edge, build a smudge fire, and suspend the hide over it, and forcing the smoke up through the inside of the hide. That smokes it. That coats the fibers, so when the leather gets wet, it doesn't get stiff again. It'll always be able to break out and be soft again.
And what benefits are the leather and the hides to an individual?
In primitive cultures worldwide, everything was made from leather for a long time. The Plains Indians, when Lewis and Clark came out and met with the Plains Indians, everything they had was made out of either plant material or was made out of leather. Their houses, their clothing, a lot of their containers were made out of leather or out of rawhide, parfleche. Today, we still make clothing out of it. I make my living from tanning. We sell to reenactors that do the mountain man. We sell it to Indians. We sell it to people who want to do beadwork, quill work, make clothing out of it. My clothing is all made out of deer I've killed and tanned.
So it's still a viable industry, even in the 21st century.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's 30 years ago, there was just a handful of people that were non-natives that knew how to tan. There was a group had to do with the 1960s and the hippies and stuff like that. They learned to tan again, and since then I've learned to tan, and I've taught hundreds of people to tan, and so it's actually blossoming. It'll never be a big, huge thing because it is a limited market and stuff like that, but we didn't let the skill die. A lot of the native tribes and stuff still had the skill, but they didn't know who to share it. They didn't know anybody else wanted to know it. So I teach several classes of the year, and any individual wants to learn how to tan, they can just come and see me and I'll teach them.
Well, we're standing in front of a stretching rack. And what benefit does this do to a hide?
Well, after I flesh and grain a hide, I stretch it in here, one, because I can clean the surface better, and it dries into a more open fibered rawhide. Like I said, the rawhide can be made into many things. You can make drums out of them. You can use them for repair work. It's basically the primitive duct tape. And at this stage, after it's dry, then it can be rolled up and used at a future date, and that's when I use it to make the leather. I take the rawhide and it's soaked in the brains to make the leather.
So when you say it's like the primitive duct tape, what's the characteristics that make it that way?
Because it's very strong. You take and wet this and relax it, soak it in water, and if you got something that's broken, you can wrap it around it or tie it around it, and when it dries, it shrinks, and when it shrinks, it draws up really tight, and it'll hold, actually be stronger than the original broken part. A lot of the mountain men and the Indians repaired broken gun stocks with rawhide, as well as other implements that they needed. It was also how they attached tools together to make a knife out of a flint blade or even out of a steel blade. You attach the handle using rawhide.
So it is really the universal tool.
Yeah. Like I said, some of the early pioneers actually made windows out of it. They would get it dry like this and then sit there and scrape it until it got thin enough to let light through. You couldn't see out of it, but you could let light in to read. And this is after it's brained and smoked, brained and dried and smoked. This is what the leather looks like. It's soft, it's warm. You can get wet, dried, and it'll still be soft and warm, and it's getting wet right now. So I'm going to put this away.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Dance all night, fiddle all day, dance all night and fiddle all day. Dance all night, fiddle all day, that's a soldier's joy. Oh, grasshopper sitting on a sweet potato vine, grasshopper sitting on a sweet potato vine, grasshopper sitting on a sweet potato vine. Along come a chicken and says she's mine. Dance all night, fiddle all day, dance all night and fiddle all day. Dance all night, fiddle all day, that's the soldier's joy. Peaches in the summertime, apples in the fall. If I can't have my pretty little girl, I won't have none at all. Dance all night, fiddle all day, dance all night and fiddle all day. Dance all night, fiddle all day, that's a soldier's joy. Oh, find the Northwest Passage, the quick way to the sea. Turns out that Northwest Passage nearly was the end of me. Dance all night, fiddle all day, dance all night and fiddle all day. Dance all night, fiddle all day, that's a soldier's joy. I curse that Rocky Mountain, so steep and slippery. I worry that another horse might fall on top of me. Dance all night, fiddle all day, dance all night and fiddle all day. Dance all night, fiddle all day, that's a soldier's joy. Oh, the captain's practice medicine on all our maladies. But please don't bleed me anymore or give me mercury. Dance all night, fiddle all day, dance all night and fiddle all day. Dance all night, fiddle all day, that's the soldier's joy.